The following video contains spoilers for the series finale of Wandavision. You have been warned. God, this is annoying. You guys better appreciate the amount of work I put into these because I had a totally different, much more decidedly negative version of this video written, recorded, and halfway edited with the intent to have it finished and uploaded before I'd watched the episode a second time. Needless to say, I ended up watching it a second time before I could finish anyway, and while it would be much more convenient for me to just let the original script be what I finish and release, some semblance of intellectual integrity is one of the few things this channel really has going for it, and it wouldn't feel right or fair to you or the show if I didn't adjust according to my current honest thoughts. I'm gonna lose so many hours of sleep over this. I'm begging all of you watching to share this around so the engagement is even close to worth it. Anyway, on with the show. The most important question going into this episode wasn't, is Hayward a total villain, or are we going to get some superhero fisticuffs, the answer to both of which turned out to be a yes. It wasn't, are we going to get the multiverse, it wasn't, who is Evan Peters playing, it's, what's Wanda going to choose to do now that she's been forced into conscious understanding that this is all on her? And for a little while, the answer seemed to be denial. Denial that I think a lot of us viewers can personally relate to. Specifically, the bubble of fans mad that a lot of their theories and speculations weren't played out. A bubble that's finally come so close to bursting that it's created what I think is a long overdue discussion about fandom, theorizing, culture, and the very real entitlement that it can create in some people. Not to mention an inability to engage with a story on its own terms. Now, this isn't all fandom's fault. I mainly lay it at the feet of pundits and outlets who know full well that the show likely isn't going to pay off some of the ideas that they incept into viewers' heads, but know that that kind of brand-related speculation is guaranteed to give them clicks. The last thing I want is to make this video or the following one all about this phenomenon, but it's become so much of the discourse that I couldn't not mention it at all. And look, my own relationship with this episode is complicated, and I cannot wait to see what taking it from the beginning is like now that I know where it's heading. That on its own is going to be fascinating. And personally, I find it incredibly gratifying that everyone's theories and expectations about Pietro or Mephisto or whatever got Occam's razored out of existence. I implore you guys, as an MCU mega fan, your enjoyment of these things will rise, not diminish, if you accept them as individual pieces of storytelling first and vessels for setting up future comic-accurate stories like 6th or 7th. I've said since we first saw him that Evan Peters was likely just playing some poor schmuck from Westview who got roped into all this. And I knew you were all setting yourselves up for disappointment because it makes no sense for this show as it's panned out to introduce the X-Men or mutants or multiverse. That's not what this show billed itself as. No one told us that was something that was gonna happen. Cross-pollination with the Fox X-Men movies doesn't seem like the kind of thing Kevin Feige would want, and it does nothing to enhance the story of WandaVision as that of one woman's grief. And no, the fact that this show tangentially ties in with a movie called The Multiverse of Madness in its final seconds is not an excuse to think otherwise. It's been 13 years, guys. We've had enough time to recognize what the MO of the MCU is, in regards to how it does or doesn't set up particular plot points and concepts in stories that nominally tie into something coming down the line. If mutants or the multiverse were ever going to be relevant to the story of WandaVision, they would have come up around episode 5 or 6 at the latest. The very idea of them being a presence in this narrative is not something that would have been sprung on us at the 11th hour. The internet theory hype machine has no one to blame but itself for this disappointment, and this reckoning is one we've needed as a fan culture for years. Theories about brand building and comic book storylines are fun, but that mindset has never actually been how this franchise works. Being a weekly TV show makes this uncharted territory for fan base and content creators who are used to getting a couple 2-hour plus chunks of material to read into every year with several months worth of time to let the hype die down. But please, take this as a cautionary tale about projecting expectations onto a story that were never given groundwork by the text. That said, I can't just praise an episode for what it doesn't do. I too have to reckon with the text. I know for a fact that a shared fear amongst some WandaVision viewers was the possibility that once our villains were revealed, the pathos of the story would take a backseat to some superpowered punch-up, and that the show would feel as though it was sacrificing the unique identity they gravitated toward to be another standard MCU thing. While I do think you can argue the action is a bit indulgent, I don't remotely feel, as I did on first viewing, that the story is bending itself uncomfortably to justify the continued laser blasting. I just feel really bad for people who were dreading WandaVision's perhaps inevitable, if temporary, transformation into an action thing, because I think the narrative will completely lose those people once that happens. Granted, it's not their fault. I think in choosing to nest some narrative turns inside of its action, the episode makes some really important points unnecessarily muddy. Specifically, on first viewing, I had no clue what was going on with Wanda and Agatha's final confrontation, and I'd felt like Wanda had reached a pivotal moment in her character arc just prior to this section of the fight that I wasn't privy to. How Wanda learned to use runes, or what exactly she was doing in unleashing her powers on Agatha only to take them back seconds later, and most importantly, what had changed between this climax and the earlier scene where Wanda puts the Hex back up to save her family to make Wanda understand that she really did have to shut it down for good, all that stuff was hazy or non-existent to me. It turns out I just let the visuals of it all and the back and forth superpowered tussling wash over me, and obscure what I'm pretty certain is the cause and effect at work here. Let's walk through it together, shall we? Wanda, still in the headspace that she needs to keep the Hex up for Vision and the kids to live, attempts to subdue Agatha with her freaky mind powers. The vision she makes Agatha see quickly turns against Wanda, and Agatha offers Wanda a deal. She takes Wanda's power, saves Wanda from her fate as the Scarlet Witch, and Wanda gets to return to her domestic bliss. Specifically, she says Wanda, her family, and the people of Westview will get to live in peace under an improved and unbreakable version of Wanda's original spell. For a moment, Wanda seems like she wants to buy in before she swiftly changes her mind, and goes back on the offensive. And I think it's in this moment, with the scenario laid out before her like that, and having been made aware of how much she's hurt the people of the town, that Wanda understands Agatha's offer would be just as much of a lie. Freedom for the people of Westview and the life Wanda wants in the Hex can't ever coexist. So, she knocks Agatha out of the vision and, under the guise of volleying magic at her to absorb, she creates runes around the town with the intent to stop Agatha and bring down the Hex for good. Presumably, Wanda just has a really good memory and got a nice long look at the runes in the previous episode. It does still somewhat read to me like we sacrificed the tightness of the narrative for the spectacle. All of what I'm saying could have been much more clearly communicated, or at least clarified after the fact. Without me having given it a second look, it plays just like the moment with Monica 2 episodes ago. What should be a transcendent moment of realization, the focal point of our protagonist's journey into becoming a better version of themselves, absent in amongst all these other trappings. But taking it for what I'm pretty sure the story wants to convey, it's a satisfying climax to the episode and Wanda's arc. Speaking of Monica, it's a shame she didn't get to play any role in that realization. Monica could have and should have been the one to relay the idea that Wanda running from her pain, from her truth, at others' expense wasn't an option anymore, thus making that part of Wanda's thought process clear to the viewer. Heck, I'd be fine with Wanda just flashing back to the talk she had with Monica in episode 7 before setting her plan in motion. Monica sadly feels very short-shrifted this episode, though not nearly as much as her own antagonist does. Poor Hayward. Gotta imagine how weird it must feel being the writer and having people come up with these really interesting interpretations of a character you know is going to be nothing but a cipher by the end. Up to the very last second, we've had people, myself included, wondering what the deal with Hayward is. Whether he's got some kind of surplus motivation, whether the show is going to do any diving into the grief and trauma that it seems like he also is dealing with in this show about grief and trauma. Weeks spent wondering if there's anything to this guy, based on clues that in the end proved to be totally accidental. When it comes time to end things, Hayward's role is purely perfunctory and he drops to the very bottom tier of MCU villains, like a witch dropping into a house after she gets hit by a car. We've established him as the military jerk who wants to kill Wanda, and now he plays that role as straightforwardly as possible. There's no nuance in sight, heck, the dude hardly even has any dialogue this episode. This is the episode more than any other previous where Wanda basically proves Hayward right, and where with Agatha we finally got someone in Hayward's vicinity who actually kind of agrees with him. I didn't need a supervillain team-up or anything, but why in this episode of all episodes does Hayward have nothing to say? Oh, and he's graduated to trying to shoot kids in the face. I don't know, all of this just seems like a desperation move by the writers so the show can ensure that no one watching sympathizes even a little bit with the only characters who don't sympathize with Wanda. And in a minute I'll get into the ways that this ending does work, I promise, but even with all Wanda has lost, even with as outwardly malicious as Hayward and Agatha both are, this is a particularly egregious case of protagonist-centered morality in the MCU. Objectively, she's done far worse than Agatha has, far worse than Hayward, who as far as I'm aware is going to jail for shooting at children who were never really alive, but Wanda gets to imprison Agatha in indefinite mental torture and it's treated like a victory, while every character who we're meant to see as good lets her go off on her own scot-free. After thinking on it, it's really just Monica's line about how the town will never know what Wanda sacrificed for them that irks me. That's the one thing that feels a bridge too far, like the show is, however subtly, trying to invalidate the hatred the citizens have. Trying to forcefully paint Wanda with at least some shades of white after an entire series that's done a great job of portraying her as morally gray. Honestly, cut that line and this whole thing feels much more nuanced and easier to swallow ethically. It's maybe the single biggest instance of a story in the MCU bending over backwards to morally accommodate its hero, and it's shocking that that can happen in a franchise where Tony Stark exists. Wanda doesn't get a happy ending, not remotely, and that in and of itself is noteworthy, but I'd have much rather we ditched the fighting and had this be a finale meditating on this woman realizing the depths of moral failure that grief had brought her to, and choosing to do the right thing by giving herself up to others' judgment. I don't know, maybe have Wanda cast out of society rather than choosing to leave it with Monica's go-ahead. It's unfortunate because I do really like ending this show with Wanda being a morally gray question mark out there in the world, but the execution of how we got there should match that concept. Monica empathizes, I get that, but that becomes kind of a counterintuitive trait when she empathizes with Wanda more than she empathizes with Wanda's many innocent victims. Wanda didn't kill anyone, but she kept thousands upon thousands of loved ones from being able to see and touch each other. Yeah, it was only 2 weeks and dead is forever, but Monica should be thinking about this. The show should be thinking about this. Monica brings up that she would have brought her mother back if she had the ability, but it's like she forgets that bringing back a loved one is not all that Wanda did here. I'm torn because I do like that only Monica forgives and understands Wanda by the end. Monica is a moral voice for the audience to attach to, but by the same token, no other figures in the story most represent the audience than the citizens of Westview. Getting civilian perspective in the MCU at all is a treat, and though it's tragic enough that Wanda gave up her love and her children to free the people, even more so is the fact that they will probably always hate her, and I can't blame them. However sad it might be, she deserves to carry that weight. That's also what I love about the second post-credit scene. We get a snapshot of what Wanda's life is like now, and she's learned the hard truth. The truth no one, including myself as I write this, really wants to accept. The truth of grief, that sometimes what it means to suffer a loss, what it means to find yourself alone, is that for a while you have to be alone. You have to exist and sustain in that solitary space. Wanda has never had to do it before. She's always had her brother or the Avengers or her family. But now she's run out of pretenses and she has to live with her loss and no one else. Except for maybe an astral projecting Darkseid, I don't know. Vision vs. Vision manages to obviously be a setup for having White Viz out in the world for future appearances, while also being a satisfying closure for Hex Vision's identity crisis. For the whole show, Vision's sense of self has been unraveling, and while getting a plot summary of his life from Darcy helped clarify and stabilize things, it's seeing his mirror image and discussing their natures through reason that lets Hex Vision fully accept that he, and by extension his children, are in his own words, conditional by their very natures. Hell, I love that this ties into the overall theme of the show, that the real Vision is defined by memory and pain, the rot, the very thing Wanda has spent the show suppressing. Having White Vision around is a choice I'm withholding judgment on. Even with his memories back, who's to say he's not going to struggle with being a fundamentally different person thanks to his programming? Either way, I'm not going to complain about getting more with Paul Bettany as this character, even if the road to get there feels clumsy. Everything with Wanda, Vision, and the boys at the end is pitch perfect, and I just gotta gush about it. The image of Wanda, Vision, and the boys walking home, the boys blissfully unaware as the hex shuts down around them, that's honestly just too cool. Tucking the boys in and then closing the door on them as the red light encroaches, that's just powerful stuff. Really, the whole goodbye, both with the boys and with Vision, has the kind of emotional power to justify everything else around it. Now, I didn't tear up, but honestly, all the action and stuff, all my narrative critiques, it all just falls away in the face of something so quiet and intimate and emotionally real. I feel as Wanda does, this sense of dread but also peace and acceptance. The genius of making whether to keep the hex up or not at Westview's expense into its own moral dilemma is that it means Wanda basically has to force herself to reach that acceptance stage of grief if she wants to do the right thing. Wanda's not a bad person, and she really does have to, for all intents and purposes, make Vision die again, make herself watch as it looms over them and finally happens, to finally process her loss in order to make the ethically correct choice. When push comes to shove, Wanda's ethics trump her trauma. Up to now, Wanda was trying anything to make her happy family life indefinite, running as she did in her past to the tropes of television to avoid facing her pain ensconced in a sense of hollow comfort. Now that she understands the stakes, understands the pain her coping mechanism has caused, she can't run to media anymore. She has to choose to live in reality. I love that in his final moments, one last time, Vision makes an appeal to reason. Nothing sums up this character more than that desire to use logic as a tool to express hope and love. Shut up, you're crying! Anyway, let's move on. This might just be a me thing, but I'd have integrated the post-credits into the body of the episode. Yeah, I know MCU movies have had story and theme-relevant stuff after the credits before, but getting closure with Monica, Darcy, and Jimmy and all the Hayward stuff, it just feels weird that that's separated from the main narrative the way it is. I don't quite know how I'd put it inside the rest of the falling action without diminishing it, and everything from the walk home up through the final image of Wanda leaving is too perfect to be interrupted like that. As it stands, it's a pet peeve with no solution. Darcy's absence also reads really weird. Like, she's been a major supporting character up to now, and she appears in a single shot this episode. Part of me wonders if they couldn't keep Kat Dennings around because this finale was shot with COVID restrictions or something. It only really sucks because I've been so endeared to her dynamic with Jimmy and Monica. I wish I'd had the chance to prepare for the possibility that 3 weeks ago was the last time I'd see them together. Possibly forever, since I'd be shocked if all three appeared in a future movie together or something. The series finale has issues that aren't insubstantial, but its heights, much like the rest of the show's brightest spots, are so well done it breaks my brain. At the end of the day, Hayward in particular proved a lame, mishandled villain, and I think this episode needed another pass structurally, in order to properly convey a lot of its ideas. But as it stands, if it were the ship of Theseus, then it's a lovely-looking, functional seafaring vessel with all the amenities, but it's also got some rotting planks in key places that can't be ignored, and which diminish its better parts by association. But what did you think? As you can tell, my thoughts are very complex, and if yours are just as tangled, or even more so, or hopefully even more straightforward, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Make your thoughts known, like, subscribe, share this around, and I'll see you in the future.